the rancher's silent wife. She was sold into marriage by her cruel father, and now she won't speak. But when a wildfire threatens the ranch, she risks her life to save the children, proving her love without words. The wind howled through the valley like a wounded thing, tearing at the dry grass and rattling the loose shutters of the ranch house. Inside, the fire sputtered weakly in the hearth, casting long, trembling shadows across the wooden floor. Clara sat by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. She did not speak. She had not spoken in months. The man who had brought her here, Thomas Hale, a rancher with rough hands and quiet eyes, moved about the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew. He did not ask her to help. He never did. He had learned early that she would not answer, no matter how gently he spoke. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. A beautiful evening, if one had the heart to notice. Clara did not. She remembered the day her father sold her. "She's strong," he had said to the stranger, as if she were a horse or a plow. "She don't talk much, but she'll work." The man, a trader with a greasy beard and yellowed teeth, had looked her over, then tossed a pouch of coins onto the table. Clara had stood frozen, her bare feet numb against the cold dirt floor. She was 17, but she felt 100 years old. Her father hadn't even looked at her when she was led away. Thomas Hale was not that man. He had found her weeks later, half-starved and trembling in the back of a saloon, where the trader had abandoned her after realizing she wouldn't obey. Thomas hadn't asked questions. He had simply draped his coat over her shoulders and taken her home. Now, she sat in his house like a ghost, neither welcome nor unwelcome. A woman without a voice, without a past she cared to remember. Thomas set a bowl of stew in front of her. Steam curled upward, carrying the scent of herbs and slow-cooked meat. He didn't wait for thanks. He knew there would be none. Instead, he took his own bowl and sat at the far end of the table, giving her space. Clara stared at the food. Her stomach twisted, but not from hunger. She had not earned this. A floorboard creaked as Thomas shifted. She felt his gaze on her, heavy with something she couldn't name. Pity. Patience. She didn't dare meet his eyes. Outside, the wind moaned again, louder this time. Thomas frowned and stood, walking to the window. His shoulders tensed. Clara followed his gaze. In the distance, beyond the grazing cattle, a thin line of smoke curled into the darkening sky. Fire. Thomas moved at once, grabbing his hat and rifle. "Stay inside," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Clara didn't nod, didn't move. He hesitated, then strode out the door, leaving it open behind him. The wind rushed in, carrying the scent of burning grass. Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Somewhere beyond the ranch, flames licked at the dry earth, hungry and relentless. And for the first time in months, she felt something stir inside her. Fear. Not for herself. For him. The moment Thomas disappeared into the dusk, Clara stood. The bowl of stew sat untouched, cooling on the table. The wind howled through the open door, scattering loose papers and making the fire flicker wildly. She should have closed it. She should have stayed inside, like he'd told her. But she didn't. Her bare feet carried her to the threshold, where she stood, staring at the horizon. The smoke had thickened, a dark smear against the violet sky. It was still far off, maybe a mile or more, but fire in dry country was a living thing, fast and merciless. She knew what it could do. A memory flashed, her childhood home, the thatched roof catching sparks from a neighbor's cooking fire. The way the flames had swallowed everything before her father even woke. She had been 9 years old, screaming soundlessly as her mother dragged her into the cold night. Now, her hands clenched at her sides. Thomas was out there. She turned back inside, her movements quick and silent. She found his spare coat hanging by the door, too large for her, but she pulled it on anyway. Then she grabbed a bucket from the kitchen, filled it with water from the rain barrel outside, and tied a soaked rag around her mouth and nose. She didn't think. She just moved. The wind tore at her as she ran toward the smoke, the bucket sloshing in her grip. The land sloped downward, and as she crested the hill, she saw it. The fire, a ragged line of orange eating through the dry grass, creeping toward the fence line where the cattle grazed. And Thomas. He was already there, beating at the flames with a saddle blanket, his hat gone, his face streaked with soot. 2 ranch hands, boys, really, no older than 15, were digging a trench, their movements frantic. Clara didn't hesitate. She ran forward, dumping the bucket of water onto the nearest flames. The fire hissed, steam rising in a cloud. Thomas turned at the sound, his eyes widening when he saw her. Clara! She didn't look at him. She just grabbed the empty bucket and ran back toward the well. Again. And again. Each trip, the fire grew hotter, the smoke thicker. Her lungs burned. Her arms ached. But she kept moving, her body acting on some instinct deeper than fear. At one point, Thomas caught her arm as she passed. "You shouldn't be out here," he rasped, his voice raw from smoke. She wrenched free without a word and kept running. The wind shifted, and the fire roared toward them, sudden and vicious. One of the boys shouted. The cattle were panicking, stampeding toward the far fence. If they broke through, they'd scatter into the hills, lost for good. Thomas swore and sprinted toward them, but Clara was closer. She didn't think. She just ran. The lead steer, a massive bull with wild eyes, charged straight for the weakened fence. Clara planted herself in front of it, arms outstretched, her body blocking the gap. The animal skidded to a stop, dirt flying. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, the beast and the silent girl. Then, with a snort, the steer turned, leading the others away from the flames. Behind her, Thomas exhaled sharply. The fire raged on, but the wind shifted again, pushing it back toward the already burned earth. Slowly, with aching effort, they beat it into submission. By the time the last embers died, Clara's hands were blistered, her dress singed, her face streaked with soot. The boys collapsed where they stood, coughing and exhausted. Thomas wiped his brow, his chest heaving. Then he looked at Clara. Really looked at her. She expected anger. A lecture for disobeying, for risking herself. But his eyes held something else entirely. Awe. And something softer. Something that made her throat tighten. She turned away before he could see it in her face. The walk back to the house was silent, the four of them trudging through the charred earth. The boys muttered their thanks before disappearing toward the bunkhouse. Thomas lingered at the porch steps, watching as Clara pulled off his coat, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. "You saved the herd," he said quietly. She didn't respond. "You saved us." Her breath hitched. She kept her eyes on the ground. He didn't push. Just opened the door for her, letting her step inside first. The fire in the hearth had burned low. Clara stood near it, staring at the embers, her body aching, her mind strangely clear. Thomas moved around her, pouring water into a basin. Then he held out a clean cloth. "For your hands," he murmured. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she took it. Their fingers brushed. And for the first time since she'd come here, she didn't flinch away. The days after the fire passed in a haze of quiet labor. Clara's hands healed slowly, the blisters fading into pink scars. Thomas left salve on the kitchen table each morning, and though she never acknowledged it aloud, she used it, rubbing the ointment into her skin with the same methodical care she gave to every chore. The ranch, too, bore scars. A stretch of pasture lay blackened, and the air still carried the faint scent of charred earth. But life moved on. The cattle grazed where the grass had regrown, the hens resumed their pecking in the yard, and the two ranch hands, Jesse and Eli, still glanced at Clara with something like reverence when they thought she wasn't looking. She noticed. She always noticed. But she kept her head down, her hands busy. Thomas let her. He was a man of few words himself, and if he sensed the shift in her, the way she no longer flinched when he passed, the way she sometimes lingered in the same room as him instead of vanishing like a shadow, he didn't mention it. Instead, he showed her. A fresh loaf of bread left on the counter, still warm. An extra blanket folded at the foot of her bed when the nights turned colder. Once, she found a small knife by the chopping block, its handle worn smooth from use. His knife, the one he always carried. A gift, or an invitation. She took it without a word. But the next morning, the vegetables were diced finer, the kindling split neater. A silent thank you. Then, one evening, the rhythm broke. Clara was mending a tear in one of Thomas's shirts, her needle moving in steady strokes by the firelight, when the door creaked open. Jesse stood there, hat in hand, his face pale. "Boss," he said, voice tight. "It's the Morgan mare." Thomas was on his feet at once. Clara didn't know much about horses, but she knew the Morgan mare was special, a sleek, dark-eyed thing Thomas had raised from a foal. She set the sewing aside and followed. The barn was warm with the breath of animals, the air thick with hay and leather. The mare stood in her stall, sweating and restless, her sides heaving. Thomas murmured to her, low and steady, as he ran his hands along her belly. "Colic," he said after a moment. Jessie swallowed. "Bad." Thomas didn't answer. Just grabbed a rope and looped it around the mare's halter. "Walk her. Slow circles. Don't let her lie down." Jessie nodded and led the mare out into the yard. Clara hovered in the doorway, uncertain. Thomas didn't look at her as he rummaged through a shelf of remedies. "Need to get oil into her," he muttered. "But she won't take it easy." Clara understood then. The mare needed medicine forced down her throat, a messy, dangerous task with a panicked animal. She stepped forward. Thomas paused when she touched his arm. She pointed to herself, then to the mare. His brow furrowed. "You sure?" She nodded. For a heartbeat, he searched her face. Then he handed her the bottle. Outside, the mare paced, her hooves kicking up dust. Clara approached slowly, her movements calm. She'd spent weeks watching Thomas with the horses, the way he never forced, never startled. She copied him now. The mare snorted, rolling her eyes, but didn't bolt when Clara lifted a hand to her neck. "Easy," Jessie murmured, though the word wasn't needed. Clara exhaled. Then, with one smooth motion, she tipped the oil into the mare's mouth. The mare tossed her head, but it was too late, the medicine was down. Jessie blew out a breath. "Well, I'll be." Thomas stood at the fence, his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable in the moonlight. Clara wiped her hands on her skirt and turned away. But as she passed him, his voice stopped her. "Thank you." 2 words. Simple. Sincere. She didn't answer. But that night, when she returned to her mending, she found a cup of tea waiting beside her chair. Steam curled from it, fragrant with honey. She drank it slowly, savoring the warmth. And for the first time in a long, long while, she almost smiled. The first frost came quietly, silvering the grass and hardening the mud ruts in the road. Clara woke to it, a sharp, clean cold that seeped through the walls and made her pull the quilt tighter around her shoulders. Downstairs, the clatter of the stove being stoked told her Thomas was already awake. She dressed quickly, her fingers stiff, and padded down to the kitchen. Thomas stood at the counter, rolling dough between his palms. Flour dusted his sleeves, and a smear of it streaked his cheek. He didn't turn when she entered, but the line of his shoulders eased slightly, as if her presence was a warmth all its own. Clara hesitated, then reached for the coffee pot. A routine, now. Him making breakfast. Her pouring the coffee. No words, but no silence either, just the comfortable hum of shared space. She set his cup beside him. He nodded his thanks. Then, a knock at the door. Both of them stilled. Visitors were rare this far out, especially in the cold months. Thomas wiped his hands on his apron and went to answer it. Clara stayed where she was, but the kitchen suddenly felt too small, the walls too close. The door creaked open. A gust of icy air. Then, "Well, ain't this cozy?" A man's voice, rough and familiar. Clara's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. The traitor. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. The room tilted, and for a dizzying second, she was back in that saloon, back in the dark, back in the grip of those hands. Thomas stepped squarely into the doorway, blocking the man's view inside. "Can I help you?" The traitor chuckled. "Just passin' through. Heard you might have worked for a man who knows cattle." "Don't need help." "That so." A pause. Then sly. "Heard you took in a stray too." "Girl don't talk." "That right." Clara's breath stopped. Thomas didn't move. "You heard wrong." The traitor's shadow shifted on the floorboards. "Funny. I had one just like her. Ran off for I could get her to her buyer." A beat of silence. Then Thomas's voice, low and deadly. "You best move on." The traitor laughed again, but there was no humor in it. "Ain't no law says a man can't claim what's his." The words slithered through the room, poison-tipped. Clara's legs trembled. She should run. Should hide. Should... No. The thought struck her like lightning. She wasn't that girl anymore. She straightened and stepped into view. The traitor's eyes locked onto her, widening. Well, There she is. Thomas half turned, his gaze flicking to Clara. Questioning, protective. She met his eyes. Shook her head once. I'm not afraid. Then she looked at the trader. And for the first time in a year, she spoke. Get off this land. Her voice was rough from disuse, but it rang clear as a bell. The trader's smirk faltered. Thomas didn't move, but Clara saw the pride flash in his eyes, bright and fierce. The trader recovered quickly, leering. So the little bird can sing. Bet your new master likes that, don't he? Thomas moved before Clara could blink. One hand fisted in the trader's coat, the other hovering near his hip, where his knife usually sat. Her knife now. Last chance, Thomas growled. The trader paled. He wrenched free, stumbling back. This ain't over. It is. The door slammed shut. Silence. Clara's hands shook. She pressed them to her sides, willing them still. Thomas turned to her. You all right? She nodded, though her throat burned. He studied her a moment, then reached out, slow, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing the scar near her temple. The one the trader had given her. You're free, Clara, he said softly. Always were. She leaned into his touch, just slightly. And this time, when the tears came, she didn't fight them. The words, once freed, did not come easily. Clara woke the next morning with her throat raw, as if speaking had torn something inside her that had long been sealed shut. Sunlight slanted through the curtains, painting the floor in gold stripes, but the warmth couldn't reach the cold knot of fear still coiled in her chest. The trader knew where she was. She sat up, clutching the quilt to her chest. The house was quiet, no clatter of pans, no creak of floorboards under Thomas's boots. He must have already left for the morning chores. Her knife lay on the bedside table, its worn handle smooth under her fingers when she picked it up. A reminder. A promise. You're free. She dressed quickly, her movements sharp with restless energy. Downstairs, she found a plate of biscuits left on the stove, still warm, and a note scrawled in Thomas's uneven hand. Gone to town. Back by noon. Stay inside if you want. She traced the letters with her fingertip. He'd never left her a note before. The biscuits tasted like ash, but she forced them down anyway. Then she grabbed her shawl and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, the sky a clear, endless blue. No sign of the trader. No sign of danger. Just the usual rhythm of the ranch. The lowing of cattle in the distance, the rustle of chickens pecking at the dirt. Normal. And yet, everything felt different. She found Jesse and Eli mending a fence near the barn. They straightened when they saw her, their expressions caught between curiosity and caution. Mornin', miss, Jesse said carefully. Clara hesitated. Then, softly, morning. Eli's eyebrows shot up. Jesse grinned. Well, ain't that somethin'? She flushed and turned toward the barn, but not before she saw their smiles. Inside, the Morgan mare nickered at her from her stall. Clara ran a hand down the mare's neck, the familiar motion steadying her. He won't come back, she whispered, to the horse or to herself, she wasn't sure. The mare blew out a warm breath, as if in agreement. Clara stayed there a while, losing herself in the rhythm of brushing and feeding, the simple, solid work of caring for something. By the time she stepped back into the sunlight, the sun was high, and Thomas's wagon was rolling up the drive. Her pulse jumped. He climbed down, his movements weary but deliberate. When he spotted her, he paused, his gaze searching hers. Everything all right? She nodded. He exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Good. Then he reached into the wagon bed and pulled out a small crate. Got something for you. Clara blinked. He set the crate on the porch steps and pried off the lid. Inside, nestled in straw, were 6 brown speckled chicks, peeping and tumbling over each other. Figured you might like to raise him, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. If you want. Clara stared at the chicks, then at him. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes were hopeful. Something warm unfurled in her chest. She reached into the crate and cupped a chick in her palms, its tiny heart fluttering against her skin. Thank you, she said. Thomas smiled, just a small tilt of his lips, but it lit his whole face. That night, after the chicks were settled in a box by the stove and the lamps were dimmed, Clara stood at the foot of the stairs, watching Thomas bank the fire. He glanced up. Needs something. She swallowed. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she crossed the room and kissed him. Just a brush of her lips against his, quick and soft. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide, his breath uneven. Clara didn't run. Didn't hide. She just waited, her heart pounding. Thomas reached for her slowly, his calloused hands cradling her face like she was something precious. "Clara," he whispered. And then he kissed her back. Winter surrendered to spring in a slow, sweet unfurling. The pastures greened, the chicks grew into fat brown hens, and Clara's voice, once rusted shut, began to flow like meltwater after a long freeze. She spoke first to the mare, murmuring nonsense into her twitching ears as she brushed her. Then to the hens, scolding them gently when they pecked at her skirts. And finally, one evening as she and Thomas sat on the porch watching the sunset, she told him about her mother. "She used to sing," Clara said, her fingers laced with his. "Old songs, the kind that don't have proper endings. Just fade away, like she did." Thomas squeezed her hand but didn't interrupt. The weight of his silence was different now. Not absence, but anchor. The trader never returned. Rumor had it he'd been run out of 3 counties over for cheating at cards, but Clara didn't care. The past had lost its grip on her. On the first day of summer, Thomas came in from the fields with dirt streaked across his forehead and something hidden behind his back. "Close your eyes," he said. Clara obeyed. Something cool and smooth slid over her finger. When she looked, a simple silver band gleamed there, sunlight catching its unadorned edges. Thomas knelt in front of her, his boots scuffing the same floorboards where he'd once left salve for her burns. "Will you?" No poetry. No grand speeches. Just a question, and the quiet certainty in his eyes that he already knew the answer. Clara pulled him up and kissed him, her ring catching the light as she cupped his face. Yes. They married under the old oak by the creek, with Jessie and Eli as witnesses and the Morgan mare decked in wildflowers. Clara wore her mother's scarf tied around her waist, its faded embroidery brushing her knees as she walked toward Thomas. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Thomas didn't kiss her right away. He pressed his forehead to hers instead, his hands framing her face like he was memorizing the moment. "Welcome home, Clara Hale," he whispered. And she was. Years later, when travelers asked about the rancher's wife, the one with the gentle hands and the easy laugh, they'd say 2 things. First, that she could calm any beast, broken or wild. And second, that when she sang to her children at night, the songs had proper endings. I hope you enjoyed Clara and Thomas's journey. This story followed the emotional arc we envisioned, from trauma to trust, silence to song, and solitude to love. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or if you'd like to explore another story in a similar style.